Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aomar Boum. I'm professor of anthropology, history, and Near Eastern languages and cultures at UCLA, and Maurice Amado chair in Sephardic studies. On behalf of the UCLA L&D Leve Center for Jewish Studies, I would like to welcome you to today's event, which highlights Professor Devi Mays, the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, recent book, Forging Ties, Forging Passports, Migration in the Modern Sephardi Diaspora. You can see right here. This book was published in 2020 by Stanford University Press. This event is part of the Maurice Amado program in Sephardic Studies. I would like to thank you for staying socially distant and intellectually engaged by joining us for these virtual events. Before we move to a conversation about today's book, let me first start by introducing Dr. Mays. Dr. Mays is Associate Professor of Judaic Studies and History at the University of Michigan. She earned a BA in Religious Studies from the University of British Columbia in 2006, and a PhD in History and Jewish Studies from Indiana University Bloomington in 2013. Her book, Forging Ties, Forging Passports, Migration in the Modern Sephardi Diaspora, is really an important work as far not only of global Sephardic studies, but also global Jewish network and diaspora across the Atlantic as well as the Mediterranean. And its importance, because of its importance, it has won a lot of prizes. It speaks volume to what it contributes. So it won the 2020 National Jewish Book Award in Sephardic Culture, the American Historical Association's 2021 Dorothy Rosenberg Prize, the 2021 Jordan Schnitzer Book Award from the Association of Jewish Studies in the category of Modern Jewish History, Africa, Americas, Asia, and Oceania, and the 2021 Alexa Naff Prize in Migration Studies. Dr. Mays is currently working on two projects, which includes an introduction to and a translation of Izmir's-based Ottoman Jewish journalist Alexander Ben Gayat's Ladino Diary of World War I, entitled Two Steps from the Abyss, an Ottoman Jewish Witness to War. And she is co-working with one of my close friend and great scholar from the University of Vanderbilt, Julia Phillips Cohen, a project on North African and Middle Eastern Jewish tastemaker in Belle Epoque and interwar Paris. It's with great pleasure that to have you here, Dr. Mays, and I'll give you a 7 to 10 minutes to introduce our conversation, and we will take it from there. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Omar, for the warm introduction, and I'm honored to be speaking with you, to have this conversation virtually. I was, hoping that it would be in person, and when the invitation first came to come speak to you when my book was coming out, the invitation came in the fall of 2019 for the book that would come out in August of 2020, and obviously quite a lot changed in the world between August of 2019 and August of 2020. So it's really a pleasure, at least, to be able to speak with you and the UCLA community and the larger community um, you know, in some form at least, in a form that is safer than in person right now. So a little bit, I guess, we'll talk briefly before moving into the conversation about the book project as a whole, and maybe just I'll tell you a little bit about what brought me to this topic. Where the book explores people, Ladino-speaking Jews from the Ottoman Empire and what had been, or what was no longer the Ottoman Empire, as they migrated out of the empire in the beginning, from the beginning of the 20th century until World War II and a little bit beyond that. And I got into this project, which was my dissertation project, really by accident. I came to graduate school knowing that I wanted to do Turkish Jewish history. I spoke Turkish. I had quite, you know, I lived in Istanbul. I had a lot of friends in the Jewish community there. And after having spent so much time there, I was really interested in learning more about questions of identity and the transition from empire to nation state, and where Jews as minorities fit within that process. And that was my interest when I started graduate school. And I knew that I needed to learn Ladino, Judeo-Spanish. I didn't know it at the time. I actually didn't know Spanish at the time either. And my advisor, my first year of graduate school, said, well, you know, you need to learn Ladino, and the easiest way, there's nowhere to study it, the easiest way for you to do it is go do an intensive Spanish language course over the summer and come back, and I'll do a readings course with you in Ladino. And so he suggested going to Spain. I couldn't afford that on my graduate student salary, but I could afford a graduate or a intensive language program in Mexico. And so I spent the summer after my first year in grad school in Cuernavaca, Mexico, studying Spanish. And while I was there, one of my close friends from college is Mexican Jewish, and his family is Syrian. They're Halabi. They're from Aleppo. His background is Aleppan. And his girlfriend at the time, and now his wife, is half Ashkenazi Jewish and half Turkish Jewish. And he said, "Oh, you know, my girlfriend, her grandmother is from Turkey." And I met her, and I was then wondering, I'm like, well, how did Turkish Jews end up in Mexico? How can I, you know, what can I read about this? Like, how can I learn more about these people who came in this period that I'm interested in? And there was nothing. And I thought, oh, there's nothing. This could be an interesting dissertation project of how this community in Mexico came to be, this Sephardi Ladino-speaking community in Mexico came to be. But also very much how it was connected still to Turkey, to the Ottoman Empire, and really through these networks of communication and networks of people. I think you can probably hear in the story that I'm telling also how much my own networks really influenced the shape that this book took, that so much of my book focuses on relationships between people in this larger Sephardi diaspora, whether that's in Mexico, in the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, in France, in the United States, and really looking at how personal connections and family connections and business connections across distances help to create and cement a Sephardi diaspora, even as empires were collapsing and nation states were trying to restrict the movements of people. And so I think for me, part of it was having lived in different places and having had friends in different places that connected these different threads together. I saw that then repeating, or rather, I started working on the project and then saw my life repeating these patterns that had, been occurring several centuries, or almost a century earlier. And so that was really what brought me to this project, and looking at in looking at these people's movements and their lives and their relationships with each other, I also came to understand really clearly that it wasn't just a story of movement from one place to another place, that you start in point A and you end up in point B, and that's all that it took. But that for many of the people in this history, they were moving constantly, whether it was internal migration, whether it was going from the Ottoman Empire, from Constantinople to France to the United States to Mexico, thinking that each destination would be the final destination, but then for different reasons moving on, all the while maintaining connections to people and businesses in the places that they pass through. Or being settled in one place, but then traveling regularly for business, going across borders or across oceans for work, or to reconnect with family. And so in this, I came to recognize this really amazing story of people who were drawing on their connections with each other, in order to remain mobile in the face of all of these governmental restrictions throughout the world on trying to keep people in general from moving, or monitoring who could move and how through the world. And that these networks that they created enabled them at various points to sort of get around or get under these restrictions that governments put in place to keep them out. So I think that that's sort of my brief story and how that connects to this.
That's a great summary. That's really, and I think you capture all the different chapters of this book that I really, really enjoyed. And so one of the things that I want to say about what this book means to me as a historical anthropologist. And I think I really hope that anthropologists read this book, because you deal with a lot of categories, anthropological categories. You deal with mobility, with networks, with agency, with state, and the rest of the people on the margin, in betweenness, or the borderlands. But instead of really using the thick theoretical, sometimes non-legible terms that some we do in our business, and fortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, it depends on people, you really bring life to these through the stories. And that's, so I don't have to read about bureaucracy, theoretically speaking, to understand what this book. You really give a life to the category of bureaucracy by just laying out how the people go on their daily lives between borders, within nation states. So with that said, I want to start by my first question is that when I read, the first thing that I actually looked at when I opened the book and I started leafing through the book, I said, but I need materiality. I need material things. I need to see passports. I need to see suitcase. I need to see pictures of people and families. There is none of that, although descriptively speaking, there is a lot of that. The way you lay out the passport, when you discuss the meaning of passport and what passports look like and all, I can sense that through the words, but I wanted to see those also through the visuals. Why that decision?
That was not a decision that was a willing decision. It was a decision that, well, it wasn't actually a decision. It was the impossibility of getting permissions for the images that I would have liked to include in the book, where I had, photographs, and I'll show you some of these images that I think really are these material, like are the material that also contain the stories, or that also bring to light these stories. Part of it has to do, a lot of the images that I had were from different archives within Mexico, the ones that I thought were the most compelling, just as images. And in, what was it, December 2018, the Mexican government put a ban on reproducing images from the archives. And they said it was a temporary ban, but it was a temporary ban that went on throughout the period where I was trying to secure permissions. Prior to that point, all it took for permission to include images from Mexican archives was an email saying, "Can I use this image?" and them saying yes. Like, there was nothing involved before that. And then this ban from, all of, like, without any reason given. So, if you're talking about bureaucracy, the bureaucracy also comes into
the afterlife. It's about the afterlife of bureaucracy.
Yeah, exactly. And then, there were also some images that I really wanted to include that were published in this community book that the Sephardi community of Mexico put out. These really, again, I'll show you some of these images, fascinating family photographs. But they couldn't the people who published the book couldn't find out who the rights owners of those images were. And so I couldn't use them either. So it was not intentional. It was not something I wanted not to have these images. And I tried to describe as thickly as I could what the photographs were, but it's a criticism that I take completely, that I agree with.
No, it's really, it's not. So Devi, if I may, I don't see it as a criticism. I thought when I read the book, I actually was intrigued by it. I thought this is really an interesting approach. You're talking about migration, you're talking about diaspora, you're talking about all these things, but you make the decision, whether it's forced decision or a decision that is out of your control, to not to put the visual. So I thought that's really an interesting way of really making another point about the fluidity, but also the untimeliness, and also the thing that nothing is fixed. So because the image is fixed things. So I thought that this mobility, because you mentioned a very important, which we're going to get back to, very important term, which is, I think, the hypermobility. The hypermobility, I thought it's really, it makes sense in this context. So so I'm going to follow up, if you don't mind, about this, because we're talking about archives, and I think between a lot of your colleagues, from Moreno to Sarah Stein, Daniel Schroeter, Devin Nar, Julia, and other scholars of Sephardic studies deal with this notion of archives. So what does this say about the multi, I would say, regional, transnational, transatlantic notion of archives, I think? So because you could have used archives from Turkey or from France or from Syria or from Lebanon, but is that because you're anchoring your work in Mexico?
No, so I did use, I spent a fair amount of time in archives in quite a lot of places. So I spent a fair amount of time in the Başbakanlık Arşivi, the Ottoman archives in Istanbul, and the Cumhuriyet Arşivi, the Republican archives in Ankara. So there are the Turkish archives. I spent some time at the Alliance archives in Paris, and then a little bit of time at the National Archives in DC, at the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, and then at numerous archives in Mexico. By and large, there aren't Jewish archives that I relied on for this, which was partially, again, a matter of circumstance. that the Turkish Jewish community doesn't allow access to their archives for security reasons, because history is so politicized there, and that the Sephardi community specifically, only the Sephardi community in Mexico, there was some sort of internal dispute in the 1980s and someone burnt all of the archives. So the other communities, other Jewish communities in Mexico have archives, but the Jewish communities don't. And so that posed a certain challenge, but also I think a certain opportunity for me, not having Jewish archives to rely on. And that Sephardi Jews, by and large, were absent or not considered in the archives of large Jewish philanthropic organizations in the United States. So the Joint Distribution Committee, for example, had, worked some with Eastern Mediterranean Jews, but not nearly as much as they worked with Eastern European Jews. B'nai B'rith didn't really pay attention to Sephardi or Middle Eastern and North African Jews at all. And so this lack of Jewish sources sort of propelled me to look for Jews in other places, and in state archives, which I thought was an interesting challenge, because it also then destabilize the category of Jew in some way, because who these people were being filtered not through a Jewish community definition of who Jewish was or who fit within that community, but rather states' definitions of how these people should be categorized. And so that they were categorized in ways that didn't necessarily correspond to how they identified, to how they related with other people. But for example, when I was first working in the Mexican National Archives, going through there was a registry of foreigners that Mexico put into effect in 1930 that required all foreigners to register. And they have cards. I'll show you here. Give you an image of one of these cards. There's a card in the Registro de Extranjeros of a woman named Rebecca Mitrani. So there were these cards that had, physical data, photograph and profile and straight on, and then information about nationality, the place of birth, religion, race, residence. And then, they would sign their name or put a fingerprint if they were illiterate. And these are all categorized in card catalogs. They're like massive card catalogs. And they're categorized by nationality. So this woman, for example, Rebecca Mitrani, immigrated to Mexico after having been in Cuba. But because her current nationality, she said, was Greek, she was put into the category of being Greek, or the category of the Greek migrants. One of the things that was, I guess going through a few points here. One of the things that was interesting in the type of work, or the way that I approached the archives, or different archives, was that I didn't want to tell a story that was focused on the perspective of one country or one state, of how states try to fit people. And I wanted to do as much as I could to try to center the people themselves. And what that meant was looking for people across archives of different states. And how the same people appeared in different contexts, in different archives, the ways that they were recorded. And that could tell me both of how the people recording them related to them, but also how they related in some ways maybe to themselves, but how they related to the people who were recording them also. And that was a way for me to center the migrants in a history of migration, where oftentimes it's told from the perspective of states trying to keep people out. And that certainly is a part of the story. But by looking at people across archives,
I love that. Sorry, I love that. And I think I actually have taken a note of that, because you say about states, their attempt to categorize, make stable, and fix population. That's actually one of your phrases, one of the statement. And then you come at some point in the book, I think around page 2, and then you say, and then you try to take that power, the bureaucratic power of the state, and then you foreground the agency of these migrants by saying that they actually thrive in motion, and then you move away from these consular border officials, the way these border officials like to believe, or at least to portray in their interactions with higher ups. And that's actually I think these two parts of the scale and the way you balancing them throughout the book, that takes me actually to my next question, which I think builds on these cards that you talk about, which is about agency. I think so. I think if you can explain to us a little bit, how did you make that decision to talk about the lives of these individuals as they moved across spaces, across nation states, given the fact that they're also in a very precarious situation?
Yeah. So that's a great question. In terms of, the agency, one of the things that I wanted to show in the book is how adept these people were at shaping themselves on documentation or through presentation into what they thought, often correctly, would be most advantageous for them to continue to move through the world. And this card of Rebecca Mitrani, I love it so much because, as you were saying, images make fixed things. They stabilize things. That's the point of documentation like this, is to fix someone in place, describe what they look like, attach their photographs. So, say how tall they are and what texture their hair was and their nose shape, so that they could be fixed, they could be understood, they could be categorized. If you look at this card, on the surface, you could say, oh yeah, they did this. Here's this woman, Rebecca Mitrani, she's on this card, her face is there, she's signed it says how tall she is, it says her nationality, her religion, all of this stuff, right? The state made sense of her and they categorized her, and now she's in this file for Greeks in the foreign registry. But if you look a bit closer at this card, you can see how much she really played with this. So she says, for example, that she is from the city of Kirkilise, and she says this is in Greece, right? Kirkilise is now known as Kırklareli. It's in Thrace, it's in Turkey. It was in the Ottoman Empire and then Turkey. It was never part of Greece. So here she's saying that the city, and actually the name she's using for the city, Kirkilise, is often the name that Jews would use for the city. So Muslims would often call it Kırklareli. The Bulgarians residents there would call it Lozengrad. The Greeks would call it Saranteklisies. And so there were different names for this city depending on your ethno-religious background. She's using a name that Jews often use and saying that this city in Turkey that had been the Ottoman Empire was in Greece. Well, why might she have done this? At this time in 1927, Turkish citizens were prohibited from entering Mexico. So entering as a Greek was possible, but not as someone who was a Turkish citizen, not as someone who, or even if she wasn't a citizen, not as someone who was from Turkey. And it was very easy to get fake papers. There was an oral history that was done.
Debbie, if you don't mind to interrupt you, I don't want to interrupt the flow of your thought.
I
but
could just talk about
but because you mentioned a little bit, you mentioned the fake paper. If you
yeah.
can elaborate a little bit on the process of forging paper and how it
Yeah.
fits in what you just said.
Okay. Yeah, yes. Okay. So I want to just highlight two more things about this card.
Okay.
One of the things also is she says that she's Orthodox. Her religion she gives is Orthodox. Well, Jews weren't forbidden from entering Mexico until 1934, but there was rising anti-Jewish sentiment that it might not be the wisest for her to put down that she was Jewish. And yet the name Rebecca Mitrani is a very Jewish name, specifically from the region of Thrace. She correctly assumed that the border guards or the consular officials wouldn't know that her name was, a Jewish name. It didn't sound stereotypically Jewish. And then she signs her name. And she signs it in Soletreo, in the Sephardi Hebrew cursive alphabet. Right? So the Jewishness comes through in the language that she's using to sign her card.
Interesting.
And she could also easily have assumed that the consular officials would see an alphabet that wasn't the Latin alphabet. And she said that her native language was Greek and just assumed that this was Greek, right? And, what's interesting is that the follow-up card that she has later on in this file, she says that she's Jewish and she signs her name in the Latin alphabet, but she continues to say that she's Greek, right? So to me, that showed that this was her agency, that she understood the stakes of trying to look a certain way, trying to fit into certain categories, and was successfully able to perform in that way. And so fake papers are, there are different types of fake papers, but fake papers are also a really important part of what I look at here. And this could range from passports that had photographs switched out. This was, relatively common, that you could switch out the photograph for someone who, someone else. These were called imported passports, that were valid passports that had belonged to someone, but then had the photographs switched out. Or the names changed, so the physical passport itself was altered. Other people would acquire fake papers, for example, exit permits from the Ottoman Empire. Sephardi naming practices follow certain patterns where, say, all of the firstborn grandsons will be named after their paternal grandfather. So you might, for example, have 7 cousins who all have the same first and last name. Well, that also made it easy to switch around papers, because one person could get an exit visa or an exit permit and then just give it to one of his cousins who had the same name. If the first one decided not to travel, or they could recycle papers in the same family. Another thing that I came across quite a lot, or not quite a lot, is people would sometimes bribe someone to get fake papers. So one of the stories that I came across was someone who encountered a Greek popcorn seller in a square in Mexico. He had come to Mexico. He was a Bulgarian citizen. He was trying to get back to Cuba, where he had lived before, but it was during World War I. And because he was Bulgarian, Cuba would not let him enter. And he met this Greek popcorn seller in a square. They started speaking Greek with each other. He told the Greek man his conundrum. The Greek man said, well, I'll go to the consul with you and you pay me this much. I'll tell him that I know you back from Kavala, where I'm from. And he did that. And this man, Salomon Leve, got Greek papers. He then used his papers to get Greek papers for his entire family. And the day after he got his fake papers, he went back to the shipping agent and said, I want my ticket to Cuba. And the man said, well, your Bulgarian? And he said, no, I was Bulgarian yesterday, but today I'm Greek. And was able to go to Bulgaria. And here's yet another example of a fake, what I might call fake papers. So this is what a Mexican passport looked like in 1920. Here, this is the passport belonging to a man named Gabriel Yermia Valenci, who was from Istanbul. Mm-hmm. And if you look at this passport, it tells a fascinating story just as a material document. You can see that it has been folded many times, likely kept in a pocket, a pocketbook or in his suit jacket. You can see how it's falling apart in places. Yeah. Here, I'm trying to replicate what it looked like. So this image, part of the image here, was attached to the side of the large sheet of paper, like a passport extension. Today, in our booklets, if you get it full, they'll put more pages in. Yeah. So here they taped another piece of paper, and here's the flip side of that piece of paper. The other side of his passport, this is the other side of it, completely covered, as you can see, with stamps and
it's amazing,
from all over the place, that he's taped it up, that it's stained with various things. And then close up, this writing on the bottom here, here's the close up of it, gives the reason of probably why he got this passport, where in 1921, it's written here that he was this Mexican citizen and got married in Constantinople in May of 1921 to a woman named Fanny Leve, and then she returned to Mexico with him. So that he traveled to Constantinople to marry someone from his hometown. She traveled back with him. Her father came with them and became the first rabbi of the Sephardi community in Mexico City. Wow. Why this is a fake passport is not the physical aspect of the passport itself. Yeah. It's not all of the visas that he got from many, many different countries, dealing with multiple layers of bureaucracy and police and registering and, consular officials. And, he had to go to officials in Mexico and New York and Paris and Athens and Switzerland and Constantinople, where he dealt with both the inter-allied occupational force in Constantinople and Ottoman like the Ottoman government, then the Spanish government who represented Mexico at the time in Constantinople, just the layers of bureaucracy that he had to move through. All of this was valid. But what makes this paper fake is that he wasn't actually a Mexican citizen, that he paid off a judge to have him declared that he was Mexican, to have him inscribed in the civil registry, the birth registry, as being born in Mexico, that then enabled him to get this passport. And what's interesting with this story is that the Mexican officials learned that this person, the judge, was bribable, and they flagged Yermia as being someone who was possibly using fake papers, but they never revoked his passport. And this didn't follow him throughout his life. They suspected it, but they didn't really do anything about it. And when you're looking at something also, I should say, sort of methodologically, when you're looking at things like fake papers or people engaged in smuggling or other sort of illegal activity, you only see it in the archival record when it fails. Right? The people who do it successfully, you don't have records of that. So you don't have the records of the bribes that were being paid, or the officials who looked the other way, or all of the people who were able to do this type of maneuvering, or all of these different types of maneuvering successfully. So you only sort of see it here and there in snippets, and often less so in official documentation than in the stories that people would share, where they're much more forthright about, what they did. Because they don't see it as illegal. They see it as like look at me, I'm so resourceful, and they were, right?
But that's actually why I really appreciate in the book the way how much time you spend on this and the paper and the passport. I actually have to go and do some readings about passports, and it's fascinating. You can write books about passports, and you have the data. It's really amazing. So there is I have to give you a lot of credit for rethinking what was called the system of foreign and consular protection that Jews and other groups during the colonial period had to rely on to move across spaces, to start businesses, to settle in other places. I think your book is really a continuation of a lot of the work that was done across the Mediterranean, in the British Empire and in the French Empire. And I can think of here of the work, you might not see it, but you might not want to give yourself this credit, but I want to give you this credit because I really see that you're building on the work of Daniel and other people who worked on these topics. And I think you really allow us as historians to really see the shift from the empire to the nation state. And before that, you connect that shift, that story of the pre-empire to the empire, the colonial state. So I think that I see really that as something that's new in your work, and it connects to that. So with that said, I want to go back to another term you use and then we can call it here diaspora. And I want to thank you because you helped me think about how I see I'm doing this project for Moroccan Jews in LA, and this idea of the one point of start to the end. I really learned a lot from your method and how to think about Moroccan Jews in LA as a quote unquote a diaspora community, but also it's a community coming from different points, but going back and forth and on a continuum spectrum. And that view leads me to the way you think about these issues, to what you call hypermobility. But in this hypermobility, I want you first of all to tell us what you mean about this to our general audience. And at the same time, I want you to, if you don't mind, I want to talk to us a little bit about where women fits in this hypermobility. Because I think, and I'm gonna put this between quote here, women, so here you have the states and their bureaucracies trying to box these men into their own categories. But at the same time, you have these men who are also as fragile, trying to box women in their own categories. So how do you go about explaining this in the book?
Okay, so hypermobility, what the reason that I use this term and why it's sort of one of the it's funny, actually, there was an anthropologist who was one of the peer reviewers for my book, and she's like, there's no theory in this at all. So to go to your earlier point, and I'm like, no, but I do think that this idea of hypermobility is sort of like, a theoretical framework that
I like it. I really like it. I really like it.
But what I meant by that, or what I saw, and what I saw these historical actors doing, and what I tried to capture through this term of hypermobility, is that these people were in a state of near constant movement. Whether, as I said, whether that was across borders, whether that was within the borders of a place, where there was oftentimes no clear endpoint, that where you might one might think your original destination would be in a few years or a few months might become a place of, prolonged transit before you move on to the next place. But that within this hypermobility, that this hypermobility also enabled the creation and the maintenance, the upkeep of a diasporic world. That so the way that I approach diaspora really it very much owe it to my advisor Matthias Lehmann and his approach to diaspora, as that diaspora isn't something that is, it's something that happens and happening and ongoing, and that it needs to be sustained, and that it's sustained through movement, whether that's physical movement of people or exchange of news and letters or commerce. And that all of this, so different forms of mobility, whether that's human mobility or the mobility of knowledge, the mobility of goods, that all of these things are tied together in hypermobility, and that all of these things enable a diaspora to be created and a diaspora to be maintained, right? And that this hypermobility was really integral to this ongoing perpetuation of a diasporic world. And so that's what I was trying to capture through this term. And I think that's really what I'm trying to capture in the book as a whole, is that sort of the connection between mobility and a transnational community, that a community can exist as a community, even as it's transnational and in a sort of state of movement and multi-nodal, sort of having different nodes, and and even lacking a clear attachment to a home. I don't know. Okay. Sorry, I'm not in my house.
I could tell.
Sorry, I don't know where this noise is coming from. But so the question of women is actually also a fantastic one, and
by the way, that's not Devi. That's really not a critique. As far I think I always face the same problem with gender, and I think it doesn't mean that we can't talk about it.
Okay, I'm sorry.
We can stop it because since they're recording, if you want to check that.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. If we could just stop for a second.
No, you don't have to worry about it. They can always edit it. So
okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't know what that is.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, with women, it's very, as and as people who do archival research know, women often don't appear as much in archival records. And that's, for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it is, they might not be, for example, present in court records in the same way as, or rather business registries in the same way as men might be. But that doesn't mean that they're not actively working, whether that's in the family business or even having their own businesses. The cards that I looked at, or other sorts of documents, immigration records where it records professions, women are often written down as, and likely often chose to be inscribed as, homemakers, or as wives or housewives, or as having no profession. And a lot of that is tied in part to sort of class understandings of what women of a certain class standing or aspiring to a certain class standing what they should be and not be. But then if you look at other sorts of records, you occasionally see that the same, or like I would sometimes see that the same woman, for example, who appears as a homemaker on her foreign registry card, then goes to court, suing people over the spot that her store is at. Yeah. So that, there's it, but it really is, one has to dig more to find women in archival materials. And so the hypermobility that I talk about, I did see that women also were engaging in this type of hypermobility, perhaps less frequently than men were, but not significantly so. Just as men were traveling for business, women also traveled for business, to other countries, or to get clothing that they would import, some like back to Mexico from New York or from Paris, to sell there, or they would travel to visit family. So there is this sort of, mobility in that way, or they would travel with their husbands when their husbands went on trips, but they were likely, helping their husbands as they were going on trips. But women did face more coercion when they traveled, and more attention, not only, from state authorities that were concerned that women traveling, especially single women traveling, could potentially be prostitutes. And particularly this was an issue for women traveling from the Eastern Mediterranean, given that Constantinople was one of the major hubs of sex trafficking in the early 20th century. And so, there were a number of documents that I came across, state documents from the United States or from Mexico or from France, saying, we heard that there are X number of single women on this ship coming in. Make sure to question them before they get off, or don't let them in. But there was also coercion from the communal level and from the family level that women experienced. Yeah. So, the chief rabbi of Istanbul would occasionally send letters to the chief rabbi in Marseille saying, we know that there are some single women, young women, traveling, who might be traveling with someone who's trafficking them. Make sure that you catch them in Marseille. But then this would also, women were also faced internal, like an additional level of threat and danger. There was one instance, for example, that I came across that I didn't include in the book, but that a woman whose father and male relatives were already in Cuba was traveling with her mother and her female siblings, and they were from a poor family, really from what was Bulgaria, and then through what became Greece when it was still Ottoman, and then Constantinople. But they were from a poor family. One of her sister's fingers were permanently disfigured from working in a tobacco factory rolling cigarettes. And they got as far as Marseille, and then they ran out of money and they couldn't continue to travel. And so they had to stay in Marseille and work. And at some point, she was raped. Yeah. And she didn't know what sex was. She didn't know how pregnancy happened. And she didn't know that she was pregnant until she arrived in Cuba, when they finally got the money to make the transatlantic trip. And when she got there and realized that she was pregnant, her family started cursing her for being a shame, for being an embarrassment, and hid the pregnancy, once the child was born, sort of adopted the child out and married her off to a man in the Sephardi community in Cuba who they described as not being fully there mentally, so that he wouldn't notice that his wife wasn't a virgin. So like the danger that she experienced in travel, and that family pressure and coercion and violence, both from from sexual assault, but also from her family, that's a unique experience, I think, that women had. And also, we're talking about photographs and photographs fixing identities. Photographs were often used as well as a way of meeting a future spouse. And so I found numerous examples of women from the Eastern Mediterranean who received letters from a man living in the United States or a man living in Mexico who was from the Sephardi community, who seemed like he was a great potential marriage partner, who sent photographs, and they thought that he was handsome, only to arrive in the port in New York or in Veracruz and realize that he didn't actually look like what he had sent, like the photograph, that he had, it's like a early 1900s version of catfishing. But because of the family pressure, because of the shame that would be associated with them traveling to marry someone and not marrying that person, they felt like they had to go through that marriage anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is fantastic. I have my last, unfortunately, I have a lot of other questions, but I'm gonna merge 3 questions in 1 question, and then that's gonna be we're gonna end on this question.
Okay.
One of the things that really powerful in your work and is how you engage, which also comes from the diversity of archives that you have visited, is language. You talked about it in the introduction. You talk about all kinds of languages. You didn't mention French, and I was very, very impressed by how you include the discussion of French in what I see literally as the main site of your work, which is still Mexico. I think, and that will lead to my other question is, so how do you place languages in this forging ties, forging passports framework that you outline, that you lay out here, and based on that, how do you position this book in this Sephardic studies in North and Latin America? Because I think you say that there is not a lot of work on Mexican Jews, which I agree with you, and we need more of that. But also this book sets up the foundation and probably expands the foundation of what the snippets of some of the works that were written about these communities here and there in Spanish are. So that's you were aware when you were doing your work and you were doing dissertation, working with Matthias and all of these things, how to place yourself in this larger map of Sephardic studies, especially in this part of the world, this part of the Atlantic. And my last question, which builds also on the Sephardic studies in the Americas, is the book. I've noticed that one of the associations that gave a prize to the book is related to, I think, Levantine or Lebanese studies, and if you can say so. So, which means that you have different communities that are really appreciating academic and the work you've done, what you how basically you rub shoulders with all these different regions and all these different entities. And it's not probably a question, it's just basically a nod to how really difficult to do this work, to speak to different groups. But at the same time, I really want to commend how successful you were in doing it. And that's my impression. That it's really the feeling that I got when I read the last section of the book, and I said, wow, this is really the closure. It's really, I feel that even as a North Africanist, I can see that, but I feel also as a North Africanist also trying to see these North African diasporas in other parts of the world, I can build on this. And I think that's something that you really should be really celebrate, and we should celebrate in this type of work. So I'll give you the last word to talk about the two questions. And then what I wanted to say is just really an appreciation of the work you've done.
Well, thank you so much. That I'm really happy to hear that. I think one of my fears, just to say, as I was working on this book, and it's also a fear that I have in general, where like I see myself very much as a transnational historian of Sephardi Jews, that this book has positioned me that way, and then what my research interests have developed into, that I like doing multi-site research and looking at people as they're moving and understanding that process. But as I was working on this, I was afraid the whole time that I would just not speak to any audience effectively, that no one would find it compelling or interesting, and that it would just sort of fall through the cracks. So, it has been, I'm really heartened to hear your words, and it was a huge honor for me to get this prize from an association that focuses on the Levantine Syro-Lebanese diaspora for the most part, that they saw value in including Jews in their understanding of Eastern Mediterranean migration. So that was incredibly heartening for me as well. The language question, it is also connected to hypermobility, in that the people who I was looking at were highly multilingual, all of them across the board. Nobody knew only one language. And this enabled them to it enabled them to be mobile. It enabled them to get around certain restrictions, that they could often claim that they were, this is something that I talk about in the book, but how French was so, because many of them came from at least some education in an Alliance school where they knew French, that when they arrived in Mexico, and this is, I think, specific to Mexico and not elsewhere in the Americas, rather than claiming a connection to the Eastern Mediterranean or the Holy Land, they claimed a connection to France. So they gave their stores French names. They advertised about their products coming from France. They, when they were peddling, they would tell their clients stories of their childhoods in Paris, even though they'd never been there before. And they're having an accent in Spanish that was not identifiably anything.
Yeah,
that could enable them to pretend or act as though it were a French accent. And what's interesting also is that they continued, I say that I'm focusing on Ladino-speaking Jews, and I use that as a framework, but it wasn't always that they used Ladino with each other. A lot of the correspondence that I saw within Mexico between different members of this community, or like people who were writing to, like, who had lived in Mexico and then were now, say, living in Shanghai, when they're writing back to the Mexican Jewish community or to friends of theirs in the Mexican Jewish community, they use French. They don't use Ladino. They don't use Spanish. So that French has became sort of a lingua franca for them. But as I said, they were highly multilingual, and that was an aspect of what allowed them, in part, to get around different restrictions, and that their languages also, the languages that they knew, didn't place them into boxes that were necessarily associated with Turks or with Jews. And so that was also helpful, even in sort of getting around experiences of anti-Semitism that would be more likely that were targeted much more at Ashkenazi Jews, who were more identifiable because of speaking Yiddish. And this is something that Adriano Brodsky, for example, has also written about in the case of Argentina. So so that there are sort of overlaps there. And to the second question, in terms of, placing this within the study of sort of Jews in the American hemisphere, one of the things that I was trying to do, I mean, there's obviously a lot of fantastic work on, American Jewish history and, Sephardi Jews in the United States, although of course there's much more work that could be done and is being done now, and fantastic work on Sephardi Jews focusing on communities in Cuba and communities in Argentina and Brazil, in Spanish and in English and in Portuguese. So there is a vibrant literature there. But one of the things that I was trying to do with this book, and that I hope it's sort of joining in a larger conversation, sort of directed at American Jewish historians in part, is to look at American Jewish history in a hemispheric perspective. That the experience of Jewish immigrants or migrants in the United States is not the paradigm for, what migrants experienced, nor is Israel. And I think, in some ways, Aviad Moreno's work is destabilizing that for Israel and, showing it in a much more sort of networked context. But, trying to destabilize the idea of the United States as being the center of migration of Jews in the Americas, and to show that it was actually much more fluid, that, that Jews in the United States, that there were Jews coming from elsewhere in the Americas to the United States, going back to where they were coming from, that some Jews immigrated to the United States, got papers, and then, decided to move elsewhere because they felt like, and did have more possibilities for economic and social mobility in a Spanish-speaking country than they did in the United States. So that and I think this is an ongoing, or I shouldn't say that this is, I know that, in the Latin American Jewish Studies Association, for example, there really is a large push amongst the scholars there, whether of literature or history or anthropology or other disciplines, of pushing this conversation of Jewish experience into a much more hemispheric perspective. And this was something that I was trying to do deliberately with this book, is to open this up, that yes, it's a transatlantic story, but it's also an American hemispheric story.
Thank you so much, Devi. It's a great honor to read the book and to have this conversation with you. I've learned a lot, and we're looking for having you here at some point in person at UCLA. And I'm really looking forward to having other conversations with you around really shared interest. And I want to say to everyone, the book is available through Stanford University Press or Amazon, or wherever you can buy books. It's a great read. And it's an enjoyable read too. So go and buy the book, and see you for next conversation, inshallah next quarter. Thank you, Devi.
Thank you so much, Omar. This was really an honor and a pleasure.